The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That's the first sentence from Hartley's novel The Go-Between. A story about two tragic lovers and the boy who takes the messages from one to the other. Which brings me to this book here, Christian Durieux and Enchantment. Cythera is the birthplace of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The French artist Watteau did a painting in the early 1700s. It's hard to make out the painting, but from this picture. But here you see Aphrodite, and you see people waiting to embark on a voyage to Cythera, presumably lovers, in an attempt to fulfill their destiny, which is to be with one another forever. An Enchantment by Christian Durieux opens with the director of the Louvre. He is being given away. He's been given a going away party, which he's not too happy to attend. And soon decides to just disappear into the Louvre. Prior to being director of the Louvre, he was finance minister, where he spent his life making sure that all the accounting was correct. But now, on the date of his retirement, he decides to go back and explore the Louvre. And in the process, he discovers a woman. This young lady has her hands before her face. And the reason is because she wants to open her eyes upon one painting and focus her entire attention upon it. And when she does, it's upon the Madonna and the child. The director is perplexed, wondering what she is doing there late at night. And she humors him, even though he is being much like a father figure at first. But as the story proceeds, he takes out a capsule of cyanide, which he says is for the Prime Minister of Italy. But soon thereafter, he tells the young woman that the cyanide is for himself. He is not well, and he wants to end his life in the Louvre. The story is by Christian Durieux and Enchantment. And the Louvre has Western civilization's great paintings, which are suggestive of our civilized behavior. Of our culture. It's a very fascinating book. It is in fact actually a poem in the narrative and artistic genre. Which brings me to Pachyderme. By Frederik Peeters. In this story, you have a woman, Clarice Sorrell, who is attempting to find her husband. The story begins in a conventional way. Traffic is stalled. Why? Because there is an elephant in the middle of the road. Clarice tells the policeman that she must get to the hospital, which is nearby, because her husband has been in an accident. The police officer says they cannot get through. So she disowns her car and proceeds on foot. On the way, she meets a pig farmer. And then we get a flashback where she is writing a letter to a man named Pierre Sorrell, who is her husband. We are not privy to the contents of that letter. But she wrote that letter prior to her husband's accident. The story continues in a conventional manner until this scene here, where she meets a strange child humanoid figure, which would normally horrify a normal person, but not her. Yeah, and in the next scene in the story, we have a surgeon who has just completed another surgery. And he is quite pleased with himself. As you can see, he begins to dance and sing. And he imagines an audience applauding his work. But soon thereafter, look at his face. And look what he does. And then he remembers a woman that he loved. And then we get back to the present, where he looks into a toilet bowl and presumably throws up. The story is Pachyderme by Frederik Peeters. If there are similarities to David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, that's obvious. But the writer, in an interview, said he was inspired by Stefan Zweig's Letter from an Unknown Woman, which was made into a film starring Joan Fontaine. In the story, a young woman falls in love with an aristocrat Many years later, the aristocrat receives a letter from that woman. He doesn't know that it's her. And the story itself becomes a rather tragic love affair. But Frederik Peeters said he was inspired by that story, which was written by Stefan Zweig. This here is his memoir, The World of Yesterday. Zweig knew everybody. He knew Freud, Ravel, the composer of Bolero, the German poet Rilke, the American reformer Jane Addams, the French writer Paul Valéry, and H.G. Wells. He survived the First World War and was alive during the First World War, Second World War. Well, at least for the first part of it. This here, The World of Yesterday, is his memoir. In his memoir, which includes, the sun shone full and strong, homeward bound, I suddenly noticed before me my own shadow, as I had seen the shadow of the other war behind the actual one. During all this time, it had never budged from me, that irremovable shadow. It hovers over every thought of mine, by day and by night. Perhaps its dark outline lies on some pages of this book. But after all, shadows themselves are born of light, and only he who has experienced dawn and dusk, war and peace, ascent and decline, only he has truly lived. Zweig and his wife left England after fleeing from Austria, his home. Zweig was Jewish. He fled to England, and then he went to New York, and from there to Brazil. In 1942, with his wife, they both committed suicide. He was disturbed by his home, Austria, Germany, in a way reliving what had happened in the First World War, but this time much worse. And he was a man who had known European culture at its peak. Like I mentioned earlier, he knew the people who were at the forefront of that culture, like Ravel, Rilke, and Wells. But everything was coming apart. And he decided it was just better to get out. When I read these stories, I came across D'Annunzio's De Notturno. D'Annunzio, like Zweig, lived during the First World War, and was there at the onset of the Second World War. Now, his sympathies were a little different. He was more in line with the fascists. But in spite of that, he wrote a beautiful book called NOTTURNO. During the First World War, he was injured. His retina from one of his eyes was damaged. And so for 3 months, he had to remain in bed, his face bandaged. But he liked to write. And on a piece of paper, he wrote a couple of lines, and his daughter organized them for him. And this beautiful story bloomed. From the book, lines like this: stay with me, lock the door, hide the key, untie my bifold, tear off my bandages, open the window wide, let me drink the potion with you again, in a cup of air, tonight. These here are the strips he would write on for 3 months, producing this beautiful memoir, fiction, biography, autobiography. Something rather unique, at least for its time. Christians arose, an enchantment. Denuncios, NOTTURNO. Word of yesterday, Stefan Zweig. PACHYDERME, Frederik Peeters. And My Life to Live by Godard, about a young woman whose dreams don't turn out the way she wanted them to be. She wanted to be an actress, but it ends up in a brothel. A professor getting ready to receive a Life Achievement Award. But as he looks back on his life, in dreams, nightmares, and memory, he wonders, what was the point? Wild Strawberries by Bergman. And one of my favorite movies of the last 15 years, Goya in Bordeaux by Carlos Sauda, which is about the Spanish painter Goya as he remembers his life. It has a beautiful score. Yes, the past is another country. They do things differently there.